Hi, I'm Lisa Hayden with Channel 6 Central Kentucky TV, community focus on Washington County. And today I'm delighted to have as our guest Fred Noe, who is the master distiller of Jim Beam Distillery, Jim Beam Bourbon Distillery.
Correct. That's right. You got all that out, Lisa. That's good. You could probably call me a lot of other things, but that was a pretty good introduction from you for sure.
Well, I tell you, Fred, you know, here I grew up in Bardstown, where you grew up, and I didn't know until I came to Springfield, and have been here the last probably 40 years of my life, that Jim Beam originated in Washington County, the bourbon.
Correct. Yeah, the family started making whiskey down on Hardin Creek. And my dad, Booker, who was born and raised right here in Springfield, challenged his brother-in-law, Forrest Grider, and Bubba Robertson to find where Jacob Beam started making whiskey. And the story Dad always told was, he told him he'd give them a case of good drinking whiskey apiece if they could figure out where Jacob Beam started making whiskey, you know, back in 1795. And those two were determined to make my father give them 2 cases of whiskey. And they did discover that there was a little piece of ground that was deeded to Jacob's wife at the time, down where Marion, Washington, and Nelson County meet, down here by Manton. And that's actually where they proved it, and Booker paid them their 2 cases of whiskey, and that's how we figured out where the Jim Beam family started making bourbon back in 1795.
And so that was Jacob, who would have been then the first generation of now 7 generations, correct?
Well, we're 8 actually. My son Freddie's into it now, so we've got 8 now that are distillers that are working. He's in the distillery, creating products and carrying the family tradition and legacy on.
Yeah. So now, Fred, you so that little piece of ground down there was called what?
Hardin Creek.
Hardin Creek, right along
You can find, actually, if you go down there and you know where to look, there is a rock that is covering a well. Then there is water in that well, and there's a root cellar that's dug into the side of the knob there. And best we know, I mean, there's no written description, but we think that's where Jacob drew his water, and that's where he stored his supplies to make his whiskey back in the late 1700s.
So then, of course, and I know you, I imagine this, I haven't read your book, I'm sorry to say yet.
It's okay.
Although I gave it as a gift to my brother Lee, who you know.
Right.
And, but it's called, I think, Bourbon Straight Up.
Beam Straight Up.
Beam Straight Up, I mean, yeah. And so it probably has the history of
tells the history of the family.
And in that history, so they started here.
Right.
And then what happened?
You know, David Beam, who was Jacob's son, you know, in the 1800s, the railroad was coming through. The railroad that used to come from Bardstown to Springfield was coming through this part of the state. And to get closer to that railroad, David Beam moved the family business from down here on the Hardin Creek up to behind Nazareth, the mother house up there in Bardstown. The old distillery is still there. Heaven Hill is using the warehouses for storage now. Okay. And that's where the family business ran until Prohibition came about. Then when Prohibition came about, Jim Beam, who was the 4th generation running the business, got completely out of it, sold the property to get away so there would be no funny business. He didn't want to go to jail. That's what his daughter, Aunt Mimi, told me, because I lived with her when I was in college over in Bardstown there. And she said, Papa didn't want to go to jail, Fred, so he sold the business and got out of it. Well, my question was, how do you sell a distillery and rack houses full of bourbon if it's illegal? And she went on to explain that back in their day, they had farms connected to the distilleries. Because when we distill the bourbon, we have a byproduct called stillage or slop that is very high in protein, that back in the old days, the distillers would use that slop to fatten up animals and then sell them on market for more income. He sold the farm and threw the distillery in just as a bonus. And that's how he got away from it. And then he tried his hand at citrus farming in Florida, which he lost a lot of money at. He tried some coal mining in eastern Kentucky, and that wasn't very successful. The third business that he did was a limestone rock quarry down in Bullock County, the old Sunbeam quarries. And on that property, there was an old distillery there. And that's when Prohibition was repealed. Jim Beam, at the age of 70, opened that old distillery back up. And that's where we are today at Claremont. So that's how we moved from Washington County to Bullock County, and one little stop in Nelson until Prohibition shut us down again.
Yeah. Wow. Prohibition lasted, I think,
20 years.
Was it 20 years?
20 years, right.
Oh, my gosh.
And Kentucky was one of the first states to vote it in, they say.
Well,
you know, history tells
and now
we're the
Bardstown is the bourbon capital of the world.
Yes, ma'am. We produce here in the state of Kentucky 95% of the world's bourbon. I don't know where that other 5% comes from, but I wouldn't drink it.
Now, Fred, but eventually the family sold the actual business to...
Yeah, Jim Beam, when Prohibition was repealed, you know, that was in the 30s. You know, hard times, you know, Depression. Jim Beam needed some financial help to be able to get the plant back up and running. So he called on some friends of his in Chicago, the Kovler family and Blooms. And they had been business associates before Prohibition. And so they really got some capital together. Jim Beam got some together, and they made a run at it, and that's how we got back started. But, you know, my dad always laughed and said that, you know, in those tough times, Jim Beam thought the folks in Chicago had some money, and the folks in Chicago thought Jim Beam had some money. And between the two groups, they made enough friends and got enough credit to get it back up and running. And then before Jim Beam passed away, he sold his interest to those families in Chicago. That's why our corporate headquarters was always in Chicago.
Oh.
That was in 1947 when he sold his vested interest of the business to them. And then that continued to let us grow and grow.
And he sold his interest to them, and but you're the master distiller.
Right.
Your father before you was the master distiller.
They still kept Beams around making the whiskey.
I was gonna say,
yeah,
and it was a secret recipe, I do believe.
Oh yeah.
And
you know,
have you had to share that recipe?
with my son? I mean, I had to share it with him, but no, we don't really have to share it. I mean, it's everybody kind of knows. You know, when you look at bourbon, you've got to do at least 51% corn in the mash bill. Most people put malted barley in their recipe because the malted barley during the cooking converts the starches in the grain to sugar. Now we use rye as our flavor grain. Some other distilleries use wheat as the flavor grain. So, you know, the secret of it would be the exact percentages. It's kind of the secret, but I could throw out percentages as long as I add up to 100. You wouldn't know if I wasn't telling you the truth or not. So
I do know, though, as you said, for it to be bourbon, it has to be 51% corn.
Yep. Corn's got to be your majority grain.
Right, right.
We use quite a bit more than 51%
yeah.
in ours. I'm not going to tell you the secret of the sugar recipe, Lisa. I know that's what you're trying to get. I know where you're going with these questions.
And now, of course, through the years, you started to expand on the types of bourbon that you produced. And I think that's pretty cool.
Well, Dad really was very innovative, and I'm sure at the time he didn't think of this, but when he released Booker's Bourbon, which is his namesake, it's bottled at cask strength, straight from the barrel. That was in the 80s, and bourbon was kind of slow then. And, you know, it was kind of considered your dad's drink or your granddad's drink. You didn't really see young people drinking bourbon. But Dad, with the help of, you know, some of his other buddies in the business, Jimmy Russell at Wild Turkey, Parker Beam at Evan Hill, Elmer T. Lee up at Blanton's, they all developed these super premium bourbons and went out on the road and started promoting and doing tastings and meeting people and kind of rekindled the fire under the bourbon category. And that's what, I think we're all living off of the rewards that those four guys, I call them the elder statesmen of the bourbon industry.
Yeah.
They're the ones that got this business back hopping again. And we're all grinning right now because, bourbon is hot as a pistol.
Yeah.
We're selling bourbon all over the world. We cannot age it fast enough because, people are, the demand curve is off the charts. It's amazing business. And we really are friends. The folks who make it, Jimmy Russell at Wild Turkey, since Dad has passed away, he's been like a second dad to me. Parker, my cousin, he'd recently passed away. We were all buddies. We really are friends, and we do get along. Now, the sales guys on the street, that's another story. But the guys that make it, we really are buddies, and we enjoy getting together. The Bourbon Festival in September, we do hang out together. We're in the rooms together. We have dinner together, and it's pretty cool. The beer companies, they're nowhere near as friendly as the bourbon companies. We all do. We do help each other out. When Heaven Hill had their devastating fire a few years ago, we made bourbon for them. We sold them some bourbon. Everybody stepped up, and we all help each other because as the tide rises, all ships rise with the rising tide.
That's right.
So whatever we can do to help each other, we're all about it.
Well, it certainly has bourbon has enjoyed a resurgence for sure, and then with all of these, of course, I remember the first time I tried Booker's. Woo, that was.
Got to cut it a little bit. You got to cut it a little bit, Lisa. A little water to it.
Yeah, a little water, a little ice.
Well, really, Dad's theory on Booker's was to allow the consumer to reduce it to the strength they want to drink it at. He just bottled it straight from the barrel because everything else we bottle, we put water to it to bring it down to the bottling strength. Booker's, you put the water or whatever you want to put in it. If you want to put it on the ice, let ice melt. It's whatever. He wanted to let you taste it like we taste it at the plant when we're sampling. That's why Booker's is the way it is.
So I'll tell you one too now with all these different things is that honey tea, that Red Stag honey. That's a nice summer drink, by the way.
I'm glad you like that. Yeah, we've done a lot with infusions. Infusing the bourbons with flavors. I'll be honest, I was pretty negative on those products, thinking that my dad would get me someday when we meet up at the land beyond. But really, those products have brought a lot of folks to the bourbon that maybe would have never drank bourbon.
Yeah.
So, that's the thing that we have to do.
It might be more of a girly drink.
You'd be surprised how many men like it. The Red Stag with the cherry. A lot of men drink it, but they won't admit it. We kind of thought that the ladies would drink it, but a lot of guys do it as a shot. So, sometimes you create products with maybe a segment in mind, but that doesn't mean that's who's going to enjoy it the most. Really, the women now have really seized Basil Hayden, our super premium bourbon that's 80 proof, very light and approachable. And the girls, which that's another thing that has really changed. Women are into bourbon now. It's not just men.
Yeah.
It used to be all our marketing was centered towards men. But we've seen that there's a lot of girls out there that are coming into bourbon. And on the bourbon trail, you see as many bachelorette parties, you do bachelor parties coming through our plant with the girls that are getting married. And it's great. It's great to have girls get involved in it because I can remember when I started doing tastings, you'd see women come and they'd be moving their glasses to the significant other that brought them. But now you see groups of ladies that come to the tastings and they ask the great questions. They're educating themselves and they enjoy bourbon. You can make a cocktail with bourbon that's just as approachable as one with clear stuff. So it's I think that's helped too. The cocktail craze, everything's playing right into our hand to make our industry do good.
Bourbon slushes, they're good.
All right, everybody's got their favorite drink.
But and Fred, that bourbon trail, that has been such an economic boom to this area. All of Kentucky, and of course Ed O'Daniel. I have to give Ed credit where credit is due with his foresight to
Governor Beshear was another one who was he presented a lot of stuff to our companies and said, look, you guys, you spend the money, build it, they will come, I think was his line in one meeting I was in with our folks. And we did about a $15 million investment in Claremont for our visitor center, and they're coming.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll see. Last year we saw 175,000 folks that came through and took tours.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we're going to see more than that this year. I mean, it doesn't matter what day of the week. Naturally, weekends are a little stronger than weekdays, but there's people there every day going on tours. I don't care if it's raining, snowing. I mean, they're there. I mean, and people want to learn about bourbon. It's and you know, Governor Beshear and his staff, they kind of use Napa Valley as the example. You know, that the tourism people in Northern California use the wineries as the hook to bring people to that area. And he was saying tourism people here in Central Kentucky can use the distilleries as a hook to bring folks to this part of the state, and it's working.
Yeah. And not only is tourism important to our economic well-being, but the jobs at your plant and the bourbon distillery has created. I mean, I don't know how many employees Jim Beam.
Here in the state of Kentucky, we've probably got close to 700 employees here in the state of Kentucky. But if you start looking at the support, you know, with like Independent Stave at Lebanon, who builds the barrels.
Right.
You know, there's a lot of things that our fingers touch. You know, and over in Bardstown Cooperage, that rebuilds the used barrels that are sold after we use them. There's a lot of folks that have, you know, benefited from the boom in bourbon. It's great.
Yeah.
It's great for our state.
Well, the wine industry has benefited too, because they're using those wine barrels to using those bourbon barrels to age wine in now.
Yeah.
And you can't use your barrel again, can you?
One time. That's the law. If it's going to be a bourbon, it's got to be a brand new barrel.
Yeah.
Which the old story on that was they said the Coopers Union lobbied to get that put into law, so we would have to buy new barrels that would protect our jobs. But really, using a new barrel allows us to get the job done in the length of time we do, because we have to get 100% of the color from the bourbon barrel. You cannot add any color to it at all. Can't add any flavors to it. So it has to come from a new barrel. Works better than a used barrel. Used barrels, it takes a longer time. You get there, maybe. But a new barrel, the charred layer and the caramelized layer of sugar is bigger, and that's where we get all that good color in a shorter period of time.
And how long now does bourbon have to be aged?
If you're going to call it straight, it's got to be aged for at least 2 years. Really, Jimmy Russell, I wish this was my quote, but Jimmy, who's an old timer in the business, he said if you had a brand new oak bucket and you put your bourbon in it and carried it 15 feet or left it in there 15 seconds, you could call it bourbon. It just has to touch a new oak wood. But most of us age it much longer than 2 years. But if you're going to put the word straight on the label, it's got to be aged 2 years. If you put Kentucky straight, it's got to be aged in Kentucky for at least 2 years.
Oh.
So there's a lot of little laws
Yeah.
that obviously a lawyer was involved when they put together the laws on bourbon. Because I mean, a normal person would say, "Oh, it's just got to be aged 2 years."
Yeah.
You know, but then they said a new barrel in Kentucky, and then you get to call it different things. But we all play by the same rules.
That keeps it in Kentucky.
That's correct. If it's going to be Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, it's
right.
got to be aged here in the state of Kentucky for at least 2 years.
Right, right. And Jim Beam, the brand Jim Beam is it's all over the world.
Oh, yeah, we're worldwide. We're the #1 selling bourbon in the world, by far.
Yeah.
And it's a proud legacy for me to carry on. I mean, it's something I didn't create it, and hopefully I don't end it. You know, we'll pass it on to my son, and we'll see this go well into the future, and folks around here can be proud of what we do.
Yeah. Well, I just I see more and more of people getting into the bourbon industry, and coming up with these new little distillery things. And I don't know. I think, well, of course you got Yellowstone over in Lebanon. I think they're more like moonshine or something.
Well, they're doing corn whiskey, which is unaged much, or aged just a little while. But the craft distilleries you're speaking of, folks are doing stuff in smaller batches and doing little crafty things with it, maybe using a different wood or a smaller barrel. But and I always jokingly tell people that Jacob Beam was a craft distiller in 1795, making
Yeah.
about 1 barrel a day.
Yeah.
If those people's families stick with it for 225 years and 8 generations, then they may become as big as we are.
Yeah.
I mean, we started out small. It wasn't like we started as the biggest one around. We
Yeah.
grew into that. Just the family staying with it and protecting the legacy, protecting the process, and just keep making good products, and everything works out for you. And I think some of the guys make some really good stuff.
Yeah. Oh, I do too. And now and see, people like to sample all kinds of, that's why we've got, this bourbon
Right.
trail. So
Oh, yeah.
now, Fred, so, of course, I remember your father well and your mom. And, there's a marketing aspect to that whole thing as well. And I'll have to say, I know you're known as perhaps the world ambassador, or
Yeah.
is that what
They kind of throw that title on me, and
yeah.
I get kind of the jack of all trades, master of none. It's one of them things that, the master distiller role has really changed a lot since Dad's early days doing it. I mean, he ran the distillery, and that was it. There wasn't any travel. And then
Okay.
in the 80s, when they released these small batch bourbons, he started traveling to promote them. Well, then when I came into it, you became the traveling salesman, so to speak, and the mouth behind the products. I mean, going on TV shows, traveling around the world. And if you talk to, say, Jimmy Russell at Wild Turkey, he lived both those lives, because Jimmy's been in the business over 60 years. He remembers when his job was being at the distillery every day, running the distillery, going home. When the distillery broke down, you went down and fixed it, just like Dad did.
Yeah.
And then as this, I guess you'd say, career changed, you have to get out on the road, meet the people, shake hands, take pictures, tell stories, do tastings, sign bottles in liquor stores. We kind of laugh about it. Why would people want us to sign a bottle? And Dad, people would say, I'm never going to open it. He said, I'm not going to sign it. He said, bourbon's for drinking, it's not for saving. And so it was, Jimmy, we laugh about it today, because him and Dad, they were characters in their own right. I mean, those two, if you put them in a sack and drew one out, you wouldn't know which one you got. They were almost like brothers. And it's, when I
Yeah.
talk to him, I see it, Dad, he tells stories and brings back great memories of my childhood. And because I grew up knowing Jimmy, because him and Booker were good friends. And it's this is a great industry to be in. I'll be honest with you. It's been a fun life for me. If I don't see tomorrow, I got no regrets. I've seen the world. I've traveled to places I never dreamed I'd set foot in. Russia. You don't go to Russia. That's where the communists are. Heck, But I've been to Russia, China.
They like bourbon too.
Yes,
Huh?
ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So,
I haven't seen anybody that doesn't like it. If you get it, present it right.
uh-huh.
The big thing is get it where you can enjoy it.
Yeah.
Cut it down to where it's pleasing to your palate. You're not just about it. It's not about a shot. Make a nice cocktail with it. Or maybe mix it with ginger ale or something. That's
Yeah.
what it's all about.
Yeah. Well, so Booker, of course, was in a way kind of larger than life, and I think you've done a good job, Fred, of following in his footsteps. And
He wore size 13 shoes. I could never fill those shoes, Lisa. Dad always told me, be yourself. Don't let them make you be me. And I've tried to take that advice and do my gig and do it my way.
And you've got the connections here in Washington County. Of course, you've still got family here.
Yep.
And we were talking about and of course you all sponsor our wonderful barbecue.
Yep. I was glad to. Barbecue
cook-off
cook-off in October.
The Jim Beam Barbecue Cook-Off, which
Right.
will be the first
Yes.
weekend in October.
Yes, ma'am.
And
Ralph Blanford, he came to me years ago and said, look, we want to do this, and we would love for Beam to be a sponsor. And, at the time, I said, well, definitely. I mean, Dad's hometown. He was born right here on Main Street. They moved up on Grundy Avenue. My grandmother, Margaret, lived up there, and I visited Springfield many times. I was telling my wife, you'd ride the bus from Bardstown, get on the Greyhound bus, come over here and pick me up and walk across the street to Snappy Grill, get a hamburger, and go up to her place and spend the week or whatever. And when Ralph told me, I said, well, it's great to be able to give back to Dad's hometown, and it's grown into something really, really big. I mean, that's what you got to think about, where you're from, anything you can do. So I know Dad would have stepped up, and I'm just trying to do the same thing he would do. And That's
Yeah.
it's all good. Ralph's a great guy. The people of Springfield, great
Yeah.
folks. I mean, just like people in Bardstown, we're all buddies. Got a lot of good friends over here, family, and I always enjoy coming over. I see faces I haven't seen since I was a kid. You know, it's always a good adventure to come to Springfield.
Well, of course, your first cousin, Margaret Grider, was my good friend, and Bess.
Right.
Went to school with Bess, and then, but you know, there's with the nose, your grandmother Margaret, who was Jim Beam's daughter, married
Frederick Booker.
Frederick Booker No.
And he worked at the bank here, First and People's Bank.
Oh, okay.
Everybody tries to connect my grandfather with the distillery. I said, no. It was my grandmother was the connection. Because, you know, when people say, how can you be Jim Beam's great-grandson and your last name's not Beam? I said, well, my grandmother was Margaret Beam.
Yeah.
And so that's the connection. And, you know, she's the one, out of Jim Beam's 3 children, she's the only one that had any children. So that's where the connection was for the family, while the last name went from Beam to No on the 6th generation. And Dad went over to Bardstown to go to St. Joe Prep to high school. And when Jim Beam passed away, he moved in with his grandmother, and he lived there. Then came back to Springfield and did some stuff, and then he got the opportunity to go to work at the distillery, and that's when he went to work, and he was there until he passed away.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great story. And then Bob No Hayden, we were speaking of, who is Ralph's father-in-law. Bob No was Booker's first cousin,
right,
because Bob No, his
mother and Pinky were brother and sister.
Okay.
Another mother connection, see?
Yeah, yeah.
You know, so that was
all interconnected.
Right.
And Basil Hayden was related to my husband
right,
back several generations.
Yep.
And some of them call it Basil.
Well,
I've
you
heard
know,
it. How do you pronounce it?
I say Basil, but you know, I joke with ambassador we used to have. He always said Basil because he had a neighbor who said Basil is the herb, Basil is the man. I said, well, you know, tomatoes, you know, whatever makes you happy.
Yeah.
But we kind of joke about it, and it's great bourbon though.
And he was related to the Beams. Is that how that was?
No, he actually started. We bought the National Distilling Company, which had a brand called Old Granddad, which a lot of people may be familiar with.
Oh,
if you look at the bottle of Old Granddad, there's a picture of an older gentleman on the label.
Right.
That's Basil Hayden.
And
he started it. He started the Old Granddad Distillery years ago.
Connection. Okay.
And we bought Old Granddad.
Okay, gotcha.
And so when we thought we would do a super premium bourbon, Dad thought it'd be kind of cool to commemorate, you know, the Old Granddad connection.
Right.
And so that's why we used his name. And his grandson was the first All-American basketball player at the University of Kentucky in 1929.
His son, Basil Hayden's
And that was his name.
Basil Hayden?
You look back in UK basketball history, the very first All-American was Basil Hayden.
Did Booker go to UK?
Yep.
And
he didn't graduate though.
But did he play football up there?
He went up there to play for Bear Bryant.
That's what I thought. And Bob
No was
did
up there,
too.
and Bob stayed up there.
Both of them played for Bear Bryant.
Dad
correct?
didn't hang around too long.
I
don't think everything didn't work out too good for him.
So he came home.
That was why he had one rule for me growing up. I had to finish college before he let me come to work.
Yeah.
Since he didn't. He came back to Springfield and kind of did his thing. But
yeah.
So he always had a rule for me. If I wanted to go to work at Jim Beam, I had to finish college.
You know, Mike, my husband used to take Bob No and Booker.
I know.
Drive them up to the UK football games.
That was an experience.
I think they took a few little bottles of that Jim Beam with them.
Probably. I would almost gamble they had several. A few would probably be an understatement, knowing the 3 of them.
Dr. Ciccone was probably in that crowd, I think. I don't know who else.
Oh, they always drew a crowd at the ball games and the tailgate because everybody, all their old buddies, they could seek out Dad and Bob No. They knew they could find a little drink. You know, always a little drink around somewhere.
Well, I know that we could sit here all day and tell some really good stories.
We can't tell all of them, Lisa. It might get somebody in trouble.
But I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you being here today. And we've got the bourbon, so we've got two things coming up. We've got the Bourbon Festival, which will be in September
Right.
in Bardstown. And you know, that draws a lot of people to Washington County that stay here and eat and stay at the hotel and different things.
Yep.
And so it's really, and people from all over the world come to the Bourbon Festival. And that'll be the
Second week in September. About the 15th, right around the 15th.
Yeah.
It starts on Wednesday, runs through Saturday.
Yeah.
I might call it a marathon for me. A lot of events, a lot of stuff. It's not a sprint. You can't try to drink it all up in the first day. You got to hope spread it out over the whole week.
You got to pace yourself, don't you?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. And the older I get, the more pace I've got to watch.
I'm sure it's pretty exhausting.
It's fun, though. I mean,
yeah.
you get to meet loyal fans from all over the world. You're exactly right. You never know what accent when somebody walks up to you and you don't want to shake hands, whether it's from, Germany, Australia, Louisville, Bardstown, Springfield. And we got loyal folks that come back every year.
Yeah.
They just love to come hang out because you can meet all the distillers.
Yeah.
And hang out with all the guys I've mentioned, and I mean, you can see we're real life people.
Yeah.
We will sign bottles. We will take pictures. Dad used to always let the women sit in his lap, and they loved doing that. I haven't quite ever figured that one out, but why the women always want to sit in Dad's lap. But he never complained. I think he liked it, but
yeah, I can't imagine him not liking it.
right.
Now your mother might not have.
Oh, Mom never cared, She just shook her head.
Yeah.
She knew him.
Yeah.
He came home with her every night, so it didn't matter.
That's right.
You can have him. A couple times you say, take him. You got to take it all, though. You don't just get a little bit.
Yeah, so, and of course I want to be sure, and speaking of mothers and wives, is your very nice
Oh, yeah, my wife, Sandy, she puts up with a lot, too.
Yeah, because you're on the road a lot, I know.
I'm on the road a lot.
It was hard getting you here on the show today, so.
Yeah, we make it happen, We got planned a long time in advance. Get it on the calendar.
Yeah.
Calendar's pretty full, but we do what we got to do.
Yeah. And your son, Fred, I'm glad Freddie, he's going into the business.
He's doing great. He's going to release a product this year called Little Book.
Oh.
And that was what Dad called him when he was a little guy. And when he's going to release a super premium bourbon, it's going to be a blend, actually, where he took bourbon and some corn whiskey, rye whiskey, and malt whiskey and blended them together to get a unique product. And it's going to be an annual release. So every year he's going to come up with something new. And he called it what his grandfather called him. So it's kind of cool.
Yeah, that really is.
I'm proud of him. He's done good. He's done good.
I look forward to trying that. Yeah.
You'll like it, I guarantee you.
Well, thank you very much, Fred, for being on here today. It's a pleasure. And I'm just looking forward to the day when we can get a little bourbon, craft bourbon over in Springfield or a distillery. You can always bring a distillery over here if you want.
Well, we might have to work on that.
Yeah.
You'll talk to my son. I'm getting, I'm getting a little old to be starting a distillery, but you never know. You never know.
Never know. So
never say never, right? That's what they say.
Never say never.
It would be. It'd be a good place. I mean, I'm sure it'd be a great place.
This is where it started.
Right.
Right
Get
here.
over on Manton, over in Washington County. It'd be good.
There you go. Yeah. So thanks again very much.
Thanks
I appreciate
for having me,
it.
Lisa. My pleasure.